Friends, let's take an exciting journey into the world of classic muscle cars. Today I'm going to tell you a fascinating story of friendship, passion for cars, and the rebirth of the legendary 1968 Plymouth GTX. In the late 1950s, three young friends, Ed, Steve, and Bob, were inherently bonded by their passion for muscle cars and, in particular, their love for a particular 1968 GTX car. Today we'll take a look at their exciting adventures from Bob's unexpected purchase of a bright blue 1967 Plymouth GTX to its rebirth after 40 years of neglect. Let's dive into the world of these unrivaled machines and learn about the transformation of an old legend into a living and working reality. Get ready for an exciting journey through time and space because we have a lot of exciting things ahead of us. In the late 1950s, when he was a little boy, Ed Moore often accompanied his mother to the local Gulf gas station where Moore's older brother Steve worked. Steve's pal Bob Wagner also worked at the Gulf station, and as Ed grew up, he, Steve, and Bob became the best of friends. Typical of the time period, the three young men were united by their obsession with muscle cars in general, and their love for a certain 1968 GTX in particular. In late 1967, Moore explains, my brother and I had a good laugh when Bob went shopping for a new station wagon for his young family and instead came home with a fire-breathing, bright blue 1968 Plymouth GTX. Though it obviously didn't have the cargo or people-carrying capacity of a station wagon, Wagner's GTX did have a lot going for it. First introduced in 1967, the GTX was designed to be a muscular, upmarket addition to Plymouth's intermediate-size family of vehicles. Along with its Roadrunner stablemate and the pedestrian Belvedere, upon which they were both based, the GTX got a pretty substantial facelift for 1968. Changes to the GTX included a new hood with faux vents, new grille, and tail lamp assemblies, double stripes running along both sides of the car between the wheels, and revised sheet metal all around. Altogether, the changes yielded a less boxy, more modern, sportier, and decisively more aggressive-looking car. In 1968, as in 67, the standard engine in the GTX was Chrysler's venerable 440 Magnum. It was rated at a very healthy 375 GP and 480 lb-8 of torque, and to the delight of anyone who has had the pleasure of driving a 440 powered Mopar, all of that muscle comes in a package that's very easy to actually live with, even in a daily driver. With a single Carter 4-barrel, moderate hydraulic lifter, flat tappet camshaft, and relatively modest 10.1. One compression ratio, it idled well, ran smooth, required very little maintenance, and was perfectly happy with premium pump fuel. Unlike other ultra-high performance engines of the era, including its more exotic 426 Hemi Big Brother, which was an available option in the GTX, the 440 made truly impressive power and torque from its sheer displacement rather than hard-to-live-with race-spec high compression, a wild and high-revving solid lifter cam, and multiple carburetors. Equally important, the 440's power was available lower in the RPM range, making it friendlier for spirited street driving. GTX came standard with Chrysler's better transmissions, which were otherwise optional in the company's other intermediate cars. GTX buyers could have either a 727 TorqueFlite automatic or 4-speed manual at no additional cost. In keeping with its positioning above Chrysler's other intermediate offerings, the GTX had a noticeably nicer interior, with bright trim and simulated wood grain appointments borrowed from the well-appointed Sport Satellite cockpit set. The GTX also had fancy, embossed vinyl upholstery instead of the Belvedere's and Roadrunner's plain Jane seat covers and door panels. All of these considerations helped convince Bob Wagner that a GTX was a better idea than the station wagon he set out to buy at Van Nuys, Plymouth, dealer Mashak Motors, on that fateful day in October of 1967. He thoroughly enjoyed his purchase for the next 6 or so years, but reluctantly parked it in 1973, the year that OPEC nations cut production and raised prices for their oil. When the cost of gasoline in the United States rose a staggering 40%, to about 55 cents per gallon for regular in the span of only a few months. Fuel-guzzling big block muscle cars quickly lost their luster for many people. Wagner replaced his GTX with, of all things, a Honda Civic. The Civic's 71.6 CID 54 HP engine wasn't nearly as much fun as the 7 times larger and 7 times more powerful 440 in his treasured GTX. But its fuel consumption was exponentially less, and with premium gas pushing 65 cents a gallon, who could argue with that logic? Wagner's GTX sat outside for the next 40 years, baking in the California sun. Though it was in need of just about everything, Ed was attracted to the car, in part because of its inherent beauty, but also in large measure because of the memories it held for him. So he inquired whether Wagner would be interested in selling it. For a period of time, I had been talking to Bob about buying the car, he recalls, and after seeking my brother Steve's advice and getting his commitment to join me in the rebuild, I made the purchase in the summer of 2014. The planets just seemed to align for this purchase, and the planned restoration, as both my brother and I are now retired from lifelong careers in separate auto repair businesses, he in general mechanical repair and me in collision repair. And given that we are both lifelong friends with the original owner and that we personally know the history of this car since it was purchased from Mashak Motors in Van Nuys, California, October 7th, 1967, we just had to have it. Though the Moore brothers intended to do a complete nut and bolt rotisserie restoration, they decided to try and get the car running before taking it completely apart, just to make sure there were no serious problems with the engine, which hadn't even been turned over in some 41 years. With very little effort, it was purring like a proverbial kitten, and immediately thereafter they took the engine and drivetrain out. The 440 engine went to the Moore's old friend Bill Moropoulos of Bill Moropoulos Racing Engines. Moropoulos is a former NHRA comp eliminator standout and well-known engine expert who went through the 440 from top to bottom and completely rebuilt it to factory specifications. After the engine and drivetrain were removed, the Moore brothers systematically disassembled the remainder of the car. We did our best to label, organize, and store every piece, Moore recalls. In spite of our best effort, it later became clear how critical this process was when it came to reassembly. When the very last bits were removed, the body went to the sand blaster, a choice that the Moores later regretted. We should have used beads to blast it or had it dipped. After getting it back from the sand blaster, they went to work straightening out the body. The body panels were pretty wavy, and the left quarter panel, which had been damaged back when the car was new, needed to be reworked, explains Ed. An interesting aside about that quarter panel: as an 18-year-old apprentice back in 1968, Bob asked me to fix that quarter, which I did, or at least I thought I did until I had to rework it. Fearing embarrassment now, I spent the better part of a month just on that quarter, pushing and pulling, picking and filing until I got it where I liked it. Ultimately, every panel was worked over to remove dings and dents, and each skim coated and primed and blocked several times. Since this GTX was delivered new in California, it never had undercoating, which is generally a blessing for a car that's lived its whole life in a dry, salt-free area. But on the other hand, without undercoating, it's impossible to hide cosmetic flaws on the car's underside. To get the underside right, recalls Moore, we mounted it on a rotisserie. It stayed on the rotisserie until the underside, trunk floor, passenger compartment, and engine bay were all painted, allowing us to install new brake and fuel lines while the car was still upside down. The Moores were restoring the car in Ed's spacious home workshop, which was very convenient. But one critical piece of equipment he didn't have was a downdraft spray booth. To achieve the stunning finish this car deserved, they decided it had to be painted in a booth, which was a logistical challenge since the car was completely disassembled. We decided it would be easier to get the car to and through the paint shop as a rolling chassis. We bolted the engine, transmission, and K-member all together and mounted it on a dolly. Having a lift at the house, the whole assembly went up through the bottom, and in less than an hour it was all bolted in, Over the next few months, we installed the front and rear suspension and made a makeshift temporary steering shaft and wheels so we could steer it around. Now off to the paint shop she went. To ensure that all the jambs and pillars looked factory, the deck lid, quarter extensions, doors, fenders, hood, and front panel had to be painted off the car. This created quite a challenge, not just in the logistics of getting the car and all the pieces to and from the paint shop without damaging anything, but reassembly of all the painted sheet metal parts was a major concern and was a particularly nerve-wracking exercise. To try and minimize the risk of scratching during this process prior to painting, while still in primer, all the sheet metal was installed, adjusted for fit, and the locations marked, and then removed for painting. In the end, gingerly, carefully, with a lot of help from Steve and Bob, it all went back together without a scratch. Over the ensuing year, the Moores painstakingly reassembled the entire car with a combination of new and restored original parts. Of the latter, a particular drip molding turned out to be the most challenging. We straightened, sanded, and polished all of the stainless drip moldings, and reveal moldings explains more. And it all went well except for one incident. While polishing a drip molding, I lost control of it and the buffer grabbed it, tied it in a knot, and shot it across the shop. I learned a lot about how far you can go with damaged stainless steel moldings after that, as my pride would not let me just throw it away. So, to my delight, over the next 3 days, I managed to fix it like new, and it's now mounted on the car.